Hello, it's me again, Sam Biagetti of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Stitcher, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So I'm going to play the second part of the longest, most ambitious lecture that I've yet posted on this podcast, which I recorded 1 year ago. And it is Myth of the Month number 20, Conspiracy Theories. So this is one of the regular repeating series that I first put on Patreon for patrons only, and it stays there for patrons only for 1 year until I release it to the whole public. So if you sign up as a patron, you'll be able to hear all sorts of other patron-only lectures, including the recent Myth of the Month number 22 on culture. And since I recorded this lecture, I have seen a lot of growth of patronage, which is really wonderful and encouraging. It makes it possible for me to just about eke out a living through this podcast. But there also have been big setbacks, particularly this month with some sort of strange malfunction in the Patreon payment system, which caused a large number of patrons' payments to be declined. If you happen to be a patron, please go into Patreon and make sure that your payments have gone through and that you have access to all the lectures. And if you are not, I really urge you to go sign up at any level, even if it's just $1, and to post, tell friends and family, spread the word, which can be just as valuable or even more so. So the link to my Patreon page will be in the description. But without further ado, this will be the second part of Myth of the Month number 20, Conspiracy Theories. It will pick up where the first part left off, and it will deal with the history and meanings of the very concept and category of conspiracy theories, where that term and category came from, and what sort of ideological agendas it serves. So there are all these sorts of social and ideological purposes that we can see conspiracy theories serving for different audiences all through the centuries. But nonetheless, there's still the psychological question of conspiracy theories. Why do some people believe in them and not others? After all, in all of these different eras, with all of these different furors around alleged conspiracies, there have always been some believers and some skeptics. Why is that? Why do some people embrace certain theories and others don't? And as a corollary, isn't there something wrong with conspiracy theorists? Isn't there a certain sort of person that all of us can recognize who absorbs these different theories, who spins different theories, and it seems impossible to dissuade them? So the question of conspiracy theories and why certain people believe them has been taken up periodically in social science research since the 1930s. So this phrase conspiracy theory was extremely rare. It was not really part of the language up until it started to appear at a low level in the 1920s, probably because of alarm over the Russian Revolution, Bolshevism, the first Red Scare. And then in the 1930s, some scholars began to research about conspiracy theories, and since that time, it's gradually grown in prominence as a bigger and bigger focus of social science research. Now, it's very difficult to find a lot of this scholarship and to piece together what scholars have found about conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists. I found in my own searches that there are many articles and studies that are behind paywalls. It would really take a small fortune just to get access to a lot of this basic work. Some of these articles are on JSTOR, many of them are not, and one has to sort of piece together the different arguments from abstracts and literature reviews. Fortunately, much of this research was reviewed and summed up in a 2014 book called American Conspiracy Theories, co-written by Joseph Parent and Joseph Uscinski. And Parent and Uscinski find that extrapolating from this accumulation of work, they find that there are 4 basic factors that apparently condition whether someone will believe in a given conspiracy theory. Firstly, there's one present emotional state based on one's immediate situation. In moments of crisis and danger, when one is under attack, or when one is coping with a natural disaster or a war, one has a heightened alertness to danger, a feeling of powerlessness, and this in turn stimulates the impulse to seek out patterns. And one can find this even experimentally. When one feels powerless or in danger, one can look at an image of pixels and discern a picture from it more readily. So that impulse to find things like text or voice or some sort of signal in the noise is heightened, and hence this seems to explain why conspiracy theories, which are efforts to discern not only meaning and pattern but also danger in the environment, conspiracy theories emerge very quickly and spread in the wake of disasters like floods or wildfires. Refugee camps are the perfect breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Secondly, a major factor in whether a person adopts a conspiracy theory is whether that theory aligns with one's existing ideology, in the sense of one's existing beliefs, commitments that have been built up over life through experience and socialization. One is much more likely to believe conspiracy theories about one's political opponents, and this seems to be true across the political spectrum. People do not simply absorb information or arguments passively. Rather, people filter and select out from what they hear and fit new information and ideas into their existing beliefs. People look for confirmation bias. People look for ideas or arguments that flatter them, that flatter their sense of themselves or self-importance. And people select for simplicity, theories that are easier to understand, that seem to simplify the world. And so people pick out conspiracy theories that make them feel important or reassured, and people on the left and right are equally likely to believe in conspiracy theories. But it does seem to be that either side, people to the left or the right, are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories at times when their party is out of power. So again, that feeling of powerlessness, of being in danger, heightens conspiratorial thinking. Thirdly, whether people adopt a conspiracy theory depends on whether that theory bolsters their group identity and their sense of adherence to a group. As I mentioned before, conspiracy theories are common among the African American population. They can be seen as a way of staying woke, so to speak, being vigilant, helping to protect the community. And across the board, conspiracy theories are particularly strong among groups that perceive themselves as in some way weak and vulnerable and in need of defense. And they are probably, as Uscinski and Parent argue, they are probably an adaptive behavior in this way. And then lastly, number 4, the final factor that they point out is individual personality. There is a so-called, as they say, conspiratorial dimension to human personalities. Some people are more prone to subscribe to conspiratorial thinking than others. It's not a stark divide, it's a spectrum. Everyone lies somewhere on the continuum of this conspiratorial dimension, from being very likely to adopt conspiracy theories to being extremely resistant to them. This conspiratorial dimension of personality is not clearly reducible to any other trait, such as sociopathy or agreeableness or disagreeableness. It's probably the result of a combination of many factors stemming from experience and socialization. As for who rates higher on this dimension of conspiratorialism, it seems to be independent of race and gender. People of all different races and both genders, or all genders, seem to be equally prone to being more conspiratorial-minded. It's also independent of political affiliation and is constant all across the political spectrum. There do seem to be class factors, or at least class correlations, in who is more conspiratorial. Being higher on this dimension is somewhat more common among the poor, lower income people, and the less educated. There also seems to be an age or generational factor. So as of when American Conspiracy Theories was printed, it seemed that this conspiratorial dimension was strongest among middle-aged people, especially Generation X, people born in the 1960s and 70s. And the authors theorize that this is because the 70s and 80s, when Generation X was growing up, was a time of exceptional cynicism and distrust of government and big institutions. As for their personalities, people who are more conspiratorial-minded, or we could say for short conspiracy theorists, tend to be somewhat more private than others and are generally less politically active and involved. They do not vote or run for office as often as others do, and they are somewhat more accepting of the idea of violence for achieving political ends. And this might make sense to many people considering cases of violence that have occurred by extreme conspiracy theorists, such as so-called sovereign citizens. So suppose we put all of this together. There is a long and continuing history of conspiracy theorizing in the Western world, which very often seizes upon scapegoats, which uses theories as ways of expressing fear, antagonism, and that these theories are adopted and propagated by people with a particular personality type, more likely to be cynical, to be loners, to be disengaged. So for all of these reasons, one could say conspiracy theories ought to be seen as artifacts of the social imagination. They serve as expressions of social anxieties and antagonisms, and if in some cases some small number of them turn out to be true, those are unusual exceptions, dwarfed by the much larger body of spurious, outlandish theories, colored in many instances by prejudice and animus. One could even say that the true cases that I recited are exceptions that prove the rule, because people point to them as these remarkable instances of conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And that shows how the vast majority of conspiracy theories are understood by most people to be false. So on the whole, then, conspiracy theories should not be taken seriously. They should be treated, at the very least, with extreme caution as highly dubious, harmful, and possibly even dangerous. And with that, the negative side rests. Okay, so we've heard different arguments here for and against conspiracy theories, or you could say in favor of treating them neutrally and impartially, the same as any other theories, and in favor of treating them as suspect, paranoid, and even dangerous. Can these two sides be somehow reconciled? It seems impossible, because on some level the two sides are not only opposed but are actually incommensurable. The divide is between, on the one hand, viewing conspiracy theories as theories, and on the other hand, viewing them as myths, meaning stories that constitute how one makes sense of the world. And when it comes to myths, factual accuracy is not necessarily important. What is more important is their social and ideological function. And this may be especially true and manifest when it comes to conspiracy theories if you have had experience of trying to present contrary facts and having them somehow deflected, explained away, or even turned around and commandeered as support for the conspiracy theory. So this question, I think, between conspiracy theories as theories and conspiracy theories as myths cannot really be decided because both things are true. It is not just one or the other. It's like asking, is a letter or a word? Well, in English, of course, it's both. One is no more correct than the other. It just depends on the context in which you're seeing it. And hence you could say, to go back to our metaphor about Nero hearing the arguments for and against Milichus's conspiracy theory, we are always stuck in that position, like Nero, of having to weigh and consider facts and evidence, but also biases, ulterior motives, motivated reasoning. Is there some shorthand by which we can know whether or not to listen to someone spinning a conspiracy theory? It would be nice if there was, but none presents itself. Nonetheless, this dilemma may not be totally unique to conspiracy theories. And there may be some way out if we step back and look at other factors that are affecting our judgment, and that may lead to entirely different lines of inquiry. So if you remember, in this disputation before the Emperor Nero, when Milichus and Scaevinus were at loggerheads, someone else had to step in that case, Mrs. Milichus, and say, there's another factor here, another player that we can question to test whether we are judging soundly. And it happened that that was the other senator, Antonius Natalis. Well, on a more conceptual and metaphorical level, we can step back and question the concept and category of conspiracy theories. Not just question whether it's useful, but in a sense begin to deconstruct it, to consider how it works ideologically, where it comes from, and what sort of agendas and social and political purposes it serves. Again, we have to go from questions to meta-questions. So some of you may already see and be thinking about the circularity of the category of conspiracy theories. If we define conspiracy theories as simply totally neutral and broad way as just theories about conspiracies, then of course we can just treat them with the same scrutiny as any other theories. But if we first define conspiracy theories at their root as false or delusional or baseless, then we have already simply built our conclusions into the very term itself, and using the phrase is simply an exercise in begging the question. And that may seem obviously illogical or unhelpful, and yet this is exactly how people today use the term all the time, to the point that it's even been incorporated to some degree into the formal definition of the term. Now, if one looks in Merriam-Webster, one might find something more cautious and more neutral. But if one looks at Wikipedia, it gives us a better reflection of sort of everyday usage of the phrase. So Wikipedia says, quote, "A conspiracy theory is an explanation for an event or situation that invokes a conspiracy by sinister and powerful groups." So it has this negative, menacing overtone written right into it. Often political in motivation, when other explanations are more probable. And then it goes on to say a bit later, conspiracy theories resist falsification and are reinforced by circular reasoning. Both evidence against the conspiracy and an absence of evidence for it are reinterpreted as evidence of its truth, whereby the conspiracy becomes a matter of faith rather than something that can be proven or disproven. Now, there's a lot of passive voice written all through this passage, right? Somebody is doing this. Someone is using circular reasoning. Someone is appropriating contrary evidence or the absence of evidence and recasting it as supporting evidence. They're taking their theory as a matter of faith. Even in this little passage just describing conspiracy theories, we're already seeing an image conjured up, a type of person, a mindset. And now one might say that these characterizations of conspiracy theories, and by implication conspiracy theorists, are grounded in real experience. And indeed, our examination of the history of conspiracy theories and of studies of the people who believe them do provide ample grounds for these sorts of characterizations. In other words, there may be good bases for this stereotype, as there sometimes are for stereotypes. But nonetheless, this ignores several contrary points that are simply glossed over in almost all discussion of conspiracy theories. Firstly, it ought to be the job of scholars and of fair-minded people, like the people who listen to this podcast, to resist and question stereotypes, not to simply buy into them because they sound right or because you've heard them many times. Secondly, this understanding of conspiracy theories is itself a form of circular reasoning. Again, if we simply define conspiracy theories as competitors to a more probable mainstream account, then that raises the question, what happens when a conspiracy theory actually wins the contest? Corroboration and evidence show it to be the more probable explanation for events. Well, what tends to happen is that then people simply stop calling it a conspiracy theory. And hence the very notion that conspiracy theories are improbable, in quotation marks, is just a circular, self-reinforcing tautology. It's the same sort of circular reasoning that we habitually accuse conspiracy theorists of. And thirdly, a third important point is that while it is true that there is a long history of paranoid, unfounded conspiracy theories in the West, nonetheless, the idea and category of conspiracy theory, with all of its many connotations, did not simply arise organically out of impartial observations. It was largely crafted and shaped mainly by elites, including scholars and government officials. So firstly, let's just talk about a brief history of the concept of conspiracy theory. If we think back to Machiavelli's time, in his era, in the height of the Renaissance, the category did not exist. And even if there were thoughts and narratives circulating about Jews, about witches, heretics, nonetheless, this was not understood as a distinct phenomenon. And philosophers and statesmen like Machiavelli saw real conspiracies as a serious threat. They did not see conspiracy theories as a threat. The phrase conspiracy theory was extremely rare in the English language all through the early modern era and all the way up to about 1920. In the 20s, it seems it started to appear occasionally, probably due to the controversies and panics over Bolshevism and the Red Scare. And as far as we can see, it was not used in a pejorative sense at that time. It simply meant theories concerning conspiracies. In the 1930s, some scholars, mainly social scientists, did begin to adopt the term and category of conspiracy theory as a specific object of study, largely as part of an attempt to explain the rise of totalitarianism. So the term always had a negative cast from the very beginning when it started to be formally discussed in scholarship. And it was seen as part of the struggle between democracy or the free world on the one hand as against totalitarianism, which is also a selective and constructed category that includes both fascism and Stalinism. So hence the hope was to find certain psychological flaws or psychological weak points that could in some way explain totalitarianism and hence allow the West to combat it. In the 1950s, the term first started to enter into popular talk, mainly due to the work of Karl Popper, a very respected, influential, mainstream scholar of science and politics. So during World War II, Popper wrote a book called, quote, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And I think there's a wonderful irony encapsulated right in the title of that book, right? The idea of an open, tolerant, free society, free exchange, and yet that idea of an open or free society always has to be contrasted against some threat, some external or internal threat that has to be combated and stamped out. There's a paradox contained right there in the very concept. So Popper wrote this book during the war, right at the height of this confrontation, as he saw it, between free society and totalitarianism. And the book includes an argument that totalitarianism is rooted in a so-called conspiracy theory of society. So in Popper's view, this is a conspiracy theory, a sort of overarching conspiracy theory, according to which all events in the world are the result not of chance or accident, but rather of intentionally planned actions and plots by the powerful. And hence, in his words, all conspiracy theories rest on this fundamental attribution error, inability to see the world as random and contingent, and the insistence that everything must be the result of actions by the powerful, you could say by the puppet masters. So Popper wrote this book during the war, and it was published later in various languages in the late 40s and early 50s. And this sort of way of understanding conspiracy theories and seeing them as connected to the threat, the specter of totalitarianism, gradually percolated into English language discourse in the 50s. And in the 60s, then, Popper's basic ideas were taken up and used mainly in order to respond to speculation about the assassination of JFK. And this fed into especially academic and scholarly discourse about conspiratorial thinking and how it presents a sort of fundamental threat to democracy and the free society. And this really laid the groundwork especially for the famous 1966 article, which I mentioned before, by Richard Hofstadter, called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. That article helped to sort of sound the alarm that there was something fundamentally wrong with America that made America a possible breeding ground for totalitarianism, whether fascistic or communistic. And this is a lot harder to reconstruct, but certainly at least by no later than 1967, the CIA had also begun to use this term. And famously, a memo was later released to the public from 1967, memo number 1035-960, which was distributed to CIA station heads to give them advice about how to respond to speculations about the JFK assassination, how to respond to allegations that the CIA itself was involved in that assassination, and probably it also was connected to what was called Operation Mockingbird, through which various CIA officials communicated secretly with journalists, pundits, commentators, and also gave them advice and talking points about how to speak to the public about political issues. And this memo has sometimes been sort of held responsible for the pejorative negative associations with the phrase conspiracy theory. But that case has really been overstated. The memo only mentions the phrase conspiracy theories once, and mainly it's concerned with the danger that these theories are being directed at them, at the CIA. It's really clear that already by this point, by the time that phrase appeared in this one place in this memo, the phrase had already taken on these sinister overtones. It already had those connotations. This is just arguably one early instance of a particular elite, in this case a government organ, using and invoking that phrase to try to marginalize or discredit criticism or allegations against them. Now, nonetheless, it seems that it wasn't until even a bit later, in the 1980s and 90s, that the phrase became even more stigmatized and associated with delusion, paranoia, insanity. It came to be closely associated with ideas about aliens, UFOs, and also the satanic panic, right? And you can think back, there is this long tradition of associating subversive conspiracies with Satan himself. And you could say that the satanic panic in the 1980s and 90s was sort of an instantiation of the same thing, but sort of metaphysically simplified. And the phrase conspiracy theory, conspiracy theorist came to link together all of these sort of persistent, recurring, paranoid ideas about Satan and also now about UFOs and aliens. This evolution of the term may have been encouraged by government using these press contacts like Operation Mockingbird. But this is uncertain, right? We don't have all the evidence. And it seems that the real full completion of this evolution to a negative, sinister, and discrediting term post-dated Operation Mockingbird, which basically operated from the 50s to the 70s. But really the definition of conspiracy theory we think of today really came into its own in the 80s and 90s. And the overall effect, you could say, what Why did this work? Well, you could simply say, well, government wanted to deflect criticism, and so they discredited critics or accusers by labeling them as conspiracy theorists. But there is an even broader overall effect that is important to notice, which is that whereas conspiracies, if we think back to Machiavelli and that whole earlier era, conspiracies were once seen as a threat against the government and against republics. Now conspiracy theories are presented as the main threat. And this has a certain kind of class reversal, right? Now the danger is not seen to be coming from elites who have the power and resources to orchestrate a conspiracy. Rather, it's coming from the populace. It's the sort of ignorant, irrational masses who are now the real threat to freedom and democracy. And so in this way, the myth of the conspiracy theorist as a personal type serves certain social purposes. It helps to draw and maintain boundaries of socially accepted thought, and it helps to maintain trust and deference in central institutions. And furthermore, as the scholars Joseph Uscinski and Joseph Parent, in their book on American conspiracy theories, as they point out, the common public image of the conspiracy theorist is often built upon the most outlandish and extreme cases. So if I mention conspiracy theories, often they're a sort of fun topic of conversation. They're also sort of lurid objects of horror and lurid fascination. People often bring up things like the lizard people theory, the idea that there is this tiny, shadowy elite network of people like Queen Elizabeth or Donald Rumsfeld who are really reptilians from some sort of, evil hybrid bloodline. There are extreme outlandish conspiracy theories like that, but they are believed by very, very few people. It's a tiny fraction. There are far more people who talk about these sort of extreme fringe theories in sort of lurid terms who don't believe in them. They get enormous outsized attention. And really, on the other hand, everybody, if you survey people about conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination or medical experiments or the CIA, really everyone believes in some conspiracy theories. It's just a question of which ones and how many. And in this way, this sort of obsessive focus on the most extreme cases gives you a really distorted, caricatured view of what a conspiracy theory is and what sort of people believe in them. Nonetheless, ironically, Parent and Uscinski, they do acknowledge this unfairness and this distortion that's inherent in the category of conspiracy theories. But nonetheless, ironically, they try in their book, American Conspiracy Theories, to set out a set of fair rules or guidelines as to how to test the strength or credibility of conspiracy theories. And they're trying to be fair-minded, but the irony is that the rules they put forward are basically exactly what any scholar would use to judge any theory at all. So to illustrate what I'm saying, I'll read this paragraph from their chapter of American Conspiracy Theories. They say, quote, "While determinative tests would be preferable, the line between conspiracy theory and conspiracy is not so easy to establish. It may be impossible in some cases to know the difference. However, while reasonable people can disagree on details, no one wants to live in a world of anything-goes theoretical nihilism. There is a consensus that the explanatory power of a conspiracy theory varies with the standards of logic and evidence that it meets, and that its value is relative to that of other explanations. Even if the available tests are flawed and can act only as rough rules of thumb, tests are a necessity. In this chapter, we adduce 6 tests, and then they list off various rules of thumb: Occam's razor, falsifiability, the worst intentions test, the cui bono test, the eternal recurrence of the same test, and the impartial spectator test, and contend that running conspiracy theories through this gauntlet of 6 tests together can provide a relative and probabilistic estimate of how true they are. Now, the great irony of this passage, I circled it after I read it in this book and wrote LOL in the margin. You could just take the word conspiracy out of it, and it holds perfectly true as a statement of normal, ordinary epistemology. You could simply say, quote, while determinative tests would be preferable, the line between theory and fact is not so easy to establish. It may be impossible in some cases to know the difference. However, while reasonable people can disagree on details, no one wants to live in a world of anything goes theoretical nihilism. There is a consensus that the explanatory power of a theory varies with the standards of logic and evidence that it meets, and that its value is relative to that of other explanations, etc., etc. So I want to point out the irony here that even people like Uscinski and Parent, who are trying to be very fair and impartial and open-minded, nonetheless fail to step back and question and deconstruct the very notion of conspiracy theories and ask whether it's helpful and why and how it came about and what sort of purposes and functions, social, political, and psychological functions it serves. Nonetheless, regardless, if we go back to our historical narrative, it was around the same time in the 1980s and 1990s when the concept of conspiracy theory had become highly stigmatized and associated with extremism, delusion, paranoia. This is when it again became an object of social scientific research. Okay, so let's talk about some of this scholarly and academic research about conspiracy theories over about the last 30 years. Well, this research is distributed across various different social science journals and a few edited volumes of essays. A great deal of it is not accessible to the ordinary lay researcher. I know this from trying. Some of these articles are on JSTOR, many of them are not. And so the arguments and the evidence that have been used must be pieced together. And this research tends to show that there are distinctive personalities and situations that lead to more conspiratorial beliefs, and that they involve a great deal of motivated reasoning and of social and political agendas. And some of that I already recounted that has been summed up in Parent and Uscinski's book. But nonetheless, these tendencies, so talking about people's psychology, people's identities, personalities, and the situations that lead them to more conspiratorial thinking, these tendencies are only tendencies. They are not universal. And even if people who subscribe to conspiracy theories tend to show these tendencies, that does not mean that they're wrong. Someone can be crazy and correct. Nonetheless, the common tendency among social science research is the desire, the aim to try to find out what is wrong with conspiracy theorists. What is their flaw? What makes them think these crazy things? So there's a continuing obsession, I would say, not only in popular discourse, but also in scholarship. There's an obsession with the character and personality of conspiracy theorists. So scholars tend to assume that conspiracy theories, firstly, are wrong. And if any theories are in doubt, they just exclude them from the study and only include ones that they are certain must be wrong. Then they look for the source of unreason, the sort of biases or motivated reasoning or character flaws that lead them to being irrational, right? They want to assume irrationality, then explain it. And the research itself, I would contend, shows several biases, some of them more excusable than others. One bias is simply the ease of measuring and quantifying psychological factors. Right? It's easy to give someone a questionnaire and then score them on their level of sociopathy or their level of tolerance for uncertainty, etc. And that can be more easily measured according to conventional techniques than other factors like how much evidence supports this theory, etc. There's also the ideological expediency. Right? If you're a researcher and you are working at a public institution or you're getting public money, it can be simply ideologically expedient to produce results that tend to stigmatize and marginalize critics of those exact same institutions. And likewise, the research tends to build up a profile of the most extreme conspiracy theorists and then put this forward as typical, right? Again, by first selecting out theories that the researchers hold to be false and then using them as your test, then you tend to get a picture of these conspiracy theorists as particularly outrageous or nefarious. Now, just as one example of what I'm talking about, the British Journal of Social Psychology published an article in 2011, co-written by two authors, with the title, quote, "Does it take one to know one? Endorsement of conspiracy theories is influenced by personal willingness to conspire." And I was able to read through this article and look at their citations because they thankfully posted it as a file online, so I didn't have to go behind a paywall. And in this study underlying this article, the two scholars tested people for the psychological trait called Machiavellianism, which is maybe a little ironic considering things we've already said about Machiavelli. But anyway, Machiavellianism is taken to be a sort of form or trait that is part of the dark triad of sociopathic characteristics, and it involves willingness to use and deceive others. And in this study, the authors found that those who scored high for Machiavellianism were also likely to endorse and ascribe to conspiracy theories. So that seems to underscore, right, and to bolster this idea that there are particular character flaws that make people conspiracy theorists. But they also find this relationship, this correlation between Machiavellianism and conspiracy theories is fully mediated by one's ability to picture oneself taking part in conspiracies. So in their argument, this means that what's happening is a case of projection, where if you yourself can see yourself taking part in a nefarious conspiracy, then you're more likely to imagine others will do the same thing, right? You're projecting your own thought process onto others. The fact that they found that it is mediated by projection means, in other words, that it's not really the bad morals or bad character of the person, or even their own willingness to engage in conspiracy, that leads them to conspiratorial theorizing. Rather, what's happening is they're asking themselves the question, is it plausible that someone would do this? And in order to weigh and gauge whether they think that's plausible, they put themselves in that situation and think, well, I would do it in that situation, therefore I can believe others would. So what it really comes down to is just the ability to picture yourself doing the same thing under certain conditions. So one might equally come to this conclusion. First of all, that's a rational thought process, right? How else are you going to judge whether other people could plausibly do something dangerous or deceitful? You ask yourself, would I do that in the same situation? And all kinds of people might do this, and one might imagine and come to a positive answer to that question for all kinds of reasons, such as having a greater feeling of desperation, maybe just having a more realistic sense and understanding of oneself and one's flaws, not being naive, or a greater appreciation of the power of temptation and its ability to overcome people's ethical qualms. So in sum, this experiment does not actually show that bad character, in this case Machiavellianism, leads to conspiracy theories, except indirectly, through a process that all kinds of people might engage in. And yet, nonetheless, that is what they put into the headline. They say, your own personal willingness to conspire leads you to become a conspiracy theorist. And in this way, I think the title misrepresents their findings and feeds into this continuing demonization of conspiracy theorists as essentially bad or dangerous people. And in sum, I think it's ironic that this whole body of work, again, I'm making massive generalizations, but based on what I've been able to see, this body of work and this growing field of research about conspiracy theories serves a very similar mythical purpose to the conspiracy theories themselves, because it serves to assign blame, to scapegoat, to find someone to blame, especially for the lack of public trust, the growing mood of cynicism in the public, which has also been, I would argue, increasing from the 1980s through to recent years, at the same time that this research and this concern about conspiracy theories has been growing. And this research provides, although it doesn't necessarily say so specifically, it provides a way to argue that growing public distrust or cynicism towards institutions is not due to events or due to broad shifts of historical conditions, but rather it is due to the bad actions and bad intentions of a few bad actors. So in this way, the very idea of conspiracy theories has become itself a myth, and you could say in some loose sense, it has itself become a conspiracy theory, right? These problems we are dealing with are not because of broad impersonal shifts in historical conditions. It's because of these few bad actors that we can scapegoat. Okay, another basic objection that one can make to this line of research, which probably I've already made more or less manifest, is, isn't this kind of analysis unfair? To go about this line of questioning by selecting out the most extreme instances of a phenomenon and then looking for the psychological patterns of the people who take part in it, and thus build up an unflattering caricature of these people. Couldn't this equally be done of anybody whose view you disagree with? Can't you always find some sort of personal flaw to attribute their wrongness or irrationality to? So to take just a narrow point on this score, conspiracy theorists always hunt, as they're described, they always hunt for reasons and patterns and for places to put blame or responsibility for events. Now, is that necessarily pathological? Why do we have to see that as some sort of strange character flaw? Isn't this equally true of even the best, most well-informed scholars? For example, I've looked recently into commentary about the origins of World War I, right? How is it that several countries in Europe that were ostensibly at peace, that had worked out their differences, then plunged into a massive world war in just a matter of weeks? And a great deal of this scholarship, the big question driving this scholarship, is the search for deeper reasons or causes. It can't just be that some guy got assassinated in Sarajevo and then all these dominoes fell and everyone went to war. There must be some greater explanation, something about militarism or imperialism that made this war inevitable, right? We need some greater overarching explanation beyond the recital of events. But looking through all these different arguments, one thing that I had to think about was, what if there isn't any grand overarching explanation? What if there's no explanation for why or how the war came about other than giving a recital of the sequence of events? And that one event led to the next until there was a war. But if I were to argue this, I think many scholars and many people in the general public would find that nihilistic, or a sort of giving up on the point of scholarship, which is to find the deeper reasons. Right? So in this way, I think this desire for explanation, and then this insistence that events cannot simply be random accidents, this is not just characteristic of conspiracy theorists, it's characteristic of all kinds of people, including scholars. And just more broadly, couldn't one equally do this, again, about any set of people that one disagrees with, such as one's political opponents, those who disagree with you about ethical issues or aesthetic questions, or people who subscribe to minority ideas about health and fitness or love or sex? Couldn't you do this about people who have different religious views from you? In other words, couldn't you just pick out those sets of people whose worldviews you most strongly disagree with, put them into a bag, and then give them questionnaires in order to tease out their biases and their personality flaws, and then come up with a conveniently unflattering picture of them? And why is it, if we don't do that with, say, Presbyterians, why do we do that with conspiracy theorists? And more broadly still, there's the broader philosophical question. What is the difference? This is something I've asked before. What is the difference between being wrong and being irrational? It's fine to say that people are wrong, that you have come to a conclusion that their views are mistaken, that you disagree with them. But when is it necessary or well-founded to then say that they're irrational? There's something wrong with them. What exactly is the boundary between wrong and irrational? Who can make that judgment, and what purpose does it serve? I think that these are important questions that run through this entire subject, but that, as far as I can see, scholarship is unbothered by. They simply charge ahead with this project of using conspiracy theories as an oddity that needs to be accounted for and as a scapegoat that can be used to account for other social problems. And this way of thinking and talking about conspiracy theories has, not surprisingly, fed into a rising public panic over the subject. There is growing popular and press interest. Press organs in particular, I think, have found that conspiracy theories can be called upon as a way to explain the political acrimony and dysfunction that is so pervasive in the West. So, for one thing, there is the common notion being propagated that conspiracy theories are increasing. And there are many places you can see this idea repeated. And just as one partial example, the New York Times published an article in July 2022 titled, quote, "Disinformation has become another untouchable problem in Washington." And this article reports about, quote, "the rising polarization of disinformation," by which they mean the idea of disinformation has become partisanized and politicized in a way that it wasn't before. And this article quotes the reports, internal reports from the Department of Homeland Security, so a government organ, and it quotes them saying, quote, "The United States remains in a heightened threat environment, fueled by several factors, including an online environment filled with false or misleading narratives and conspiracy theories," end quote. Now, of course, the DHS has the right to put forward that idea, that characterization of the threat against the United States. But one could ask, well, what is their basis? Why do they think that? Is it true? But this article in the New York Times simply uncritically repeats and amplifies this idea for a wider public audience. The idea that we are in a time of exceptional paranoia and conspiratorialism. But as historians can tell you, every era has been thought to be the peak of paranoid conspiratorial thinking. In this way, it's a lot like the crime rate. People, no matter what, always think that crime is going up, even at times when it's dropping or at record lows. People always see it as higher than ever. And just briefly, to quote again Uscinski and Parent in their book American Conspiracy Theories, they begin chapter 5 saying, quote, "Conspiracy theories are a permanent fixture on the American landscape. But for such popular perennials, no one seems to agree on when their peak season is. Journalists have not been shy about perpetually proclaiming an age of conspiracy." And if one just uses the very blunt tool of the Google Ngram viewer, which tracks how frequently words and phrases have appeared in English through the decades, use of the word conspiracy in print in English has not gone up. It's fluctuated somewhat up and down, but basically has slightly declined over time from the 19th century to now. But on the other hand, the phrase conspiracy theory has been increasing since the 1950s. So I think that this underscores what I'm arguing, that the panic now is increasingly about conspiracy theories and how they are endangering democracy, freedom, etc. But of course, to be totally fair and impartial, we have to ask, can one measure? Is there any way to trace and to track whether conspiratorial thinking is increasing? Why would it be that the phrase conspiracy theory is rising? Is there some actual reason for it? If we take as a hypothesis the idea that conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking are rising, that is actually impossible to track and measure because of the changing, and I would argue broadening, meaning of the phrase. What exactly constitutes a conspiracy theory? On what grounds do you label a theory a conspiracy theory if it doesn't actually explicitly use the word conspiracy? An important question that comes up is a cover-up of a mistake a conspiracy? Is that enough to qualify? For example, if some people argue that the COVID-19 virus came out of a virological lab, some people have dismissed that as a conspiracy theory. Now, it might be impossible, it might be debunked by evidence, but it does not explicitly involve a conspiracy. It only involves negligence and an accident. Nonetheless, some critics would say it's still a conspiracy theory because it implies a cover-up of the mistake or the accident. But that argument has enormous implications. Any sort of misconduct, any sort of accident, is followed up by denials and usually by some sort of cover-up. People who committed an accident that then led to the deaths of millions of people are reasonably going to try to cover up what happened. So if it is off limits to allege even a mistake or an act of negligence followed by a cover-up, if that is then a conspiracy theory and unacceptable, well, that then means that nobody can theorize about any sort of misconduct. All of it then is beyond the pale. At least one cannot do so without fear of being labeled as insane or paranoid. And one has to ask then, what about the chilling effect? Even if one thinks that a theory like this lab leak theory is ridiculous, has been debunked, if labeling it as insane and socially unacceptable or dangerous, if that's the response, doesn't that then have a chilling effect on any sort of criticism or questioning of the conduct of government or academia or any major institutions? And has that trade-off ever been considered? Not as far as I have seen. And lastly, as I hinted at before, the panic has led to an ironic situation where the fear of rising conspiracy theories itself leads to the creation of new conspiracy theories. As an example of this, one could look to an article in the Guardian newspaper from June 2022, which is titled, it's currently titled, quote, "Network of Syria Conspiracy Theorists Identified," and then it has a subtitle that begins, "Campaign Disseminating Disinformation Sent Thousands of Tweets." The body of this article begins by saying, quote, "A network of more than 24 conspiracy theorists, frequently backed by a coordinated Russian campaign, sent thousands of disinformation tweets to distort the reality of the Syrian conflict and deter intervention by the international community, new analysis reveals." End quote. And then this article cites a study by an organization called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and uses that as its basis for this characterization. But it does not discuss the evidence or the arguments in this study by Institute for Strategic Dialogue. It simply quotes from it uncritically. And the article includes no direct examination of the evidence, no examination of the institutional source. Who is the Institute for Strategic Dialogue? Who organized them? Who funds them? Are they a reliable source? What's their track record? Rather, it simply repeats this allegation of a, quote, coordinated effort without substantiation, much like the New York Times article, which alleged coordinated campaigns of disinformation. And the Guardian article includes the idea that these various journalists are all somehow part of one single operation that is being coordinated and supported by Russia. And so, like any classic conspiracy theory, it includes an attribution to a nefarious foreign mastermind. Again, without evidence. And it happens that the headline for this article originally said, quote, "Russia-backed network," but they had to take out that phrase Russia-backed because readers objected that there was no support for that idea. They also had to add onto the end a very long note, an entire paragraph onto the end, recording one particular journalist's objection to how he was characterized in this article, and arguing that no evidence was presented in the article or in the ISD report that he had ever put forward any disinformation. And at no point did any of these critics take issue with any of his statements. So basically, all the main claims in this article, the idea that these tweets were disinformation, that they were Russia-backed, that they were part of a coordinated campaign, are basically all admittedly unfounded. Right? The Guardian included this note from this journalist and had no refutation for it. And one can see a similar effect, although in a much more sort of vague and diffuse form. You can see a similar effect in the New York Times article that I talked about before. The imbalanced treatment and double standards. Right? The article decries the danger of conspiracy theories, but it characterizes all sorts of claims or discourse as disinformation resulting from coordinated campaigns. Although it does not explain who coordinated them or to what end. And even just the word disinformation itself, it's important to note, has always had a conspiratorial meaning. It was not a word in the English language in the 19th century, except on occasions when it was used as a sort of joke, like in spoonerisms, like mixing up miss and dis. It only came into the language in the 1930s and 40s as a way of referring to propaganda campaigns coming from enemy countries, first Nazi Germany and then the Soviets. So there's always some conspiratorial attribution implied in that word disinformation. But again, the article does not say who is launching and coordinating these campaigns. It alleges a hostile conspiracy, again, without evidence. It quotes from government sources, but it does not ask what is the evidence or argumentation behind those sources. And hence, in this way, the article itself can be seen as unsubstantiated, paranoid conspiracy theorizing. It crosses the line from simply saying misinformation is propagating and spreading, and that's causing a problem, to saying nefarious actors are intentionally plotting to spread disinformation. So, nonetheless, I'm not taking a position on whether the assertions in this article are true. They may or may not be true. I am not taking any position on that, but undeniably it is a conspiracy theory, right? The Guardian article and the New York Times article that I've been discussing are both forms of conspiracy theory. Now, nonetheless, regardless of how you might want to describe these articles I've been discussing, nonetheless, there is a growing consensus that conspiratorial thinking is increasing, and specifically because of the internet. So let's talk about the internet factor. Doesn't it stand to reason that crazy or kooky ideas can spread more easily online, as is often said? Well, certainly the internet, for one thing, presents a massively lowered barrier to publication. It's much easier for anybody, anywhere in the world, to just log on, post whatever they want, and then have it shared immediately with unlimited numbers of people. So maybe it's true that this leads to the acceleration and multiplication of fringe ideas, including conspiracy theories. But again, this is really impossible to verify. How do you compare the circulation of conspiracy theories online as against previous media, the many magazines, pamphlets, and books, and radio programs that have spread conspiracy theories far and wide through the years, and also just regular old word of mouth, which has always proved to be perfectly sufficient for spreading rumors, paranoia, and fringe theories. For instance, in World War II, there was a wave of rumors and extreme theories that circulated quickly through the home front population. And certain officials, like an Oregon state official, complained, quote, "We are being invaded with lies and propaganda." And the OWI, the Office of Wartime Information, set up a special project called the World War II Rumor Project, which compiled hundreds of reports on rumors and strange theories, such as, if you glance through just one of them, is the idea that Japanese-American farmers were poisoning farm fields to destroy the crops. And these various reports that have been collected through the war were put into 141 folders that are now in the Library of Congress. Has anyone studied and looked through those hundreds of reports about all of these different rumors and theories circulating in the population? What kind of things were people saying? Not as far as I know has any historian even worked from that material. So if that's the case, how can we even begin to compare the past and today, the level of conspiracy thinking in the past as opposed to now? Now, something else that the internet definitely does, it does lead to the enormous multiplication of documentation. Right now, people aren't necessarily just sharing paranoid ideas by word of mouth. They're putting them into text form, which then gets archived one way or another. So the documentation is massively multiplied. But this can also be misleading, right? It makes it possible for observers to then look and at their fingertips immediately find many examples of any crazy conspiracy theory they want. The more lurid, the better, right? One can think about the furor over the Flat Earth Society. They managed to put together a convention. They've got at least a few hundred followers. But in the scale of the population, that is an unbelievably tiny fraction. And yet all sorts of people have heard about them and talked about them and can go on their website and see their theories, their arguments, their images, and so on. So I think that this whole situation, what it does is it feeds into a vicious cycle where conspiracy theories get a lot of attention. They're talked about. The most extreme and insane ones get the most attention. And then when we see this and we get upset about it, we blame the internet. It's the internet's fault because I'm seeing this conspiracy theory. So there's this assumption that there's an increase as a result of the internet. This assumption, it might start as sort of folk wisdom, but then it also, I think, has made its way into scholarship and journalism. It's all kind of part of this growing echo chamber. So, for example, in that article by the scholars Douglas and Sutton that I mentioned before from 2011 titled "Does It Take One to Know One?", that article includes a brief review of previous literature about conspiracy theorists. And the article includes the following sentence in that literature review. It says, quote, "Further, research also shows that the popularity of conspiracy theories has increased in recent years, most likely due to the ease with which they are disseminated on the internet." End quote. So when I read that line, of course, I immediately thought, okay, this is great. We're onto something here. What is this research and what does it show? Well, the sentence has two parenthetical citations in it. So for the phrase increasing in recent years, the parenthetical citation is Machiavelli, 1995. So looking into their bibliography, I found that is referring to a paper from 1995. So that means 16 years before the article that I'm reading was published. So first of all, how can you say that tells you something about recent years when you're using a 16-year-old source? And if you look at this article, it actually is an article that discusses people's biases and theories about the JFK assassination. And it argues that when people are presented with new facts or new evidence about the event, their biases guide how they assimilate that new evidence. And they're more likely to just become more hardened in their opinions as they learn new facts, whether that is a conspiratorial opinion or a non-conspiratorial one. Either way, their biases cause them to just assimilate new facts in ways that reinforce their existing beliefs. The article, as far as I can discern, contains no evidence that conspiracy theories are rising over time. It is simply an experiment to see how people deal with new information. So I would say that citation absolutely in no way supports this claim in Douglas and Sutton's article that research shows the popularity of conspiracy theories, quote, has increased in recent years. Then as for the other part of the sentence, the ease with which they are disseminated on the internet. Well, for that part, they have another parenthetical citation to Coady, 2006. So what's that? Well, that is an edited volume published in 2006 titled Conspiracy Theories, The Philosophical Debate. And that volume contains 13 different essays written by 6 different authors. And in this parenthetical citation, Douglas and Sutton make no indication of what essay or what author they are citing. They just throw in this whole book. And as far as I can tell, from what I can see of this book, from the abstract, the introduction, the chapter titles, I cannot see where any one of these authors claims that conspiratorialism has increased due to the internet. Maybe it's in there somewhere, but I cannot, the citation does not help me to find it. So what I would speculate happened here when Douglas and Sutton were writing their literature review is that they basically took common conventional wisdom notions that they had heard in popular talk, they repeated them, putting them into their article, and then filled in citations to make it look as if they had sources for these claims, when in fact there is no scholarly source for either of those claims, that conspiratorial thinking is rising or that it's rising because of the internet. And if we look again back, I know that this is sort of my hobby horse, but it's so useful. If we look back at that New York Times article from July, it shows a similar pattern. Rather than looking for evidence or arguments to support these conventional wisdom notions about the increasing threat of disinformation, instead it simply repeats uncritically government views and statements. And it cites these discussions within the Department of Homeland Security about, quote, addressing national security threats fueled by the internet-enabled rapid spread of false information. But it doesn't discuss whether there really is a serious or rising threat. It just takes those views for granted and doesn't consider the possible biases or guiding agendas that might lead an organ like the Department of Homeland Security to put forward those claims. So hopefully all of these discussions will also bring into clearer relief another problem, which is the lack of even-handed scrutiny. And I mean this in several ways. The lack of an even-handed scrutiny, firstly, with regard to different conspiracy theories coming from different sources. So amidst all of this fear and consternation about the circulation of conspiracy theories among the populace, there doesn't seem to be any concurrent examination of state-sponsored or state-propounded conspiracy theories. And the fact is, states put forward conspiracy theories all the time, just the same as anybody else does. Historically, conspiracy theories have been used to start wars, such as the false conspiracy theory that the USS Maine, when it exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, exploded because of an intentionally placed mine by the Spanish government, which then was used, in the slogan, "Remember the Maine," was used as a motivation for the U.S. to go to war with Spain. Also, you can think of the false conspiracy theory that Saddam Hussein was secretly hiding weapons of mass destruction somewhere in Iraq. So the state puts forward conspiracy theories for various reasons. Also, as I said before, conspiracy is a term of law, and it is used to charge citizens with crimes all the time. And if one examines how charges of conspiracy are used, very often they are used in far-fetched allegations that then fall apart when they are examined in court. And it's well documented, it's practically routine, that the FBI, the NYPD, and other government agencies often claim that someone conspired in terrorism, was part of a terrorist plot. But then when formal charges are brought, they end up being thrown out, or the accused persons are acquitted in court, most often due to the reason of entrapment. In other words, the court system often finds that government executive agents recruited, urged on, easily manipulated individuals to take part in plots, usually imagined artificial terrorist plots, and then arrest them. And this system has been used many times, for one thing, against young and alienated Muslim men, but also against others. And last year, New York Times Magazine had an extensive report on an FBI agent named Terry Albury, who came forward, along with supporting documents, to expose how the FBI frequently blackmailed and coerced people into taking part in their investigations, often after entrapping them into fake orchestrated conspiracies where most or all of the participants were actually government agents. One can also look at the recent case of the plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer. So prosecutors last year alleged that a group of 14 men had conspired to kidnap the governor, to then flee and blow up bridges behind them in order to cover their escape, to take her to a secret house, put her on trial, and then either hang her for treason or set her adrift in a boat on Lake Michigan, and then to travel around the country fomenting more uprisings to start a civil war. Now, out of these 14, 6 were charged with federal crimes. 2 of these 6 pled guilty to minor weapons charges. One of them agreed to testify in court against the others. So 4 were put on trial. Of those 4, 2 were acquitted of all charges. 2 resulted in a hung jury. The jury could not come to a verdict one way or another, so they are now being retried in a new trial. Now, again, I have no position on exactly what did or didn't happen here, and I have no prediction about what's going to happen in these prospective new trials. But it is clear that the state is having a great deal of trouble in proving their case that this plot was real. And it happens that Governor Whitmer herself has made no comment about the entire affair except one indirect remark in a speech where she said that she had heard, quote, reports that sound like something out of fiction, end quote. One can read into that or not what you will. So again, I do not know what did or did not happen. I do not know what the outcome of these trials will be. And I do not know if the people on trial are horrible, violent people. But regardless of all that, in all of the reporting about this scandalous case, there has been, as I can see, no mention of the long history of entrapment by moles and undercover officers who find fringe people, people with extreme views, people with emotional problems, and then encourage them to take part in concocted terrorist plots. And I have never seen in all this reporting any use of a term like conspiracy theory to describe the charges against these defendants. So I would say there's an unevenness here in how and why people use the term conspiracy theory to describe different conspiracy theories from different sources. There also is a different sort of double standard here, which is a lack of scrutiny of the opposite bias. In other words, the bias of excessive skepticism or resistance to conspiracy theories that might be true. So it may be, as Popper argued, that there is a fundamental attribution error when one sees random chance events as instead somehow orchestrated. But then what about the converse? What about mistakenly attributing orchestrated events to random chance? Is that not also an attribution error, just in the other direction? Maybe that sort of error is much more rare. But do we know? How rare? Is it non-existent? Has anyone studied this? Has there been any investigation of people who fail to see patterns or intentions or agendas behind what they consider to be just random events? Remember, as Parent and Uscinski said in their book, all of us lie along a continuum from more to less conspiratorial-minded. It's a spectrum. So if we have so thoroughly critically examined those who are at the far extreme of conspiratorial thinking, why don't we examine those who are at the opposite extreme? What about the most extreme cases of those whom conspiracy theorists like to call dupes? Where are the psychological studies analyzing those who, say, disbelieve that MKUltra is real when they're presented with facts about it? Well, for an example, there was an article published last year in Frontiers of Science, which I think might be revealing in this regard. And the article examined people in the United Kingdom who subscribed to different explanations of the origins of COVID-19. So they talked to people who believed that COVID-19 came out of a scientific lab, those who believed that it came from animals by way of a wet market, and those who believed that it was caused by 5G cell networks. And they came up with different psychological traits that corresponded or correlated with people who subscribed to the different theories. So those who believed in the laboratory or 5G explanations, one could call them the conspiracy theorists, right? And believers in the lab theory showed a correlation with right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. I don't know exactly what that is. Believers in the 5G theory also showed social dominance orientation, but not right-wing authoritarianism. In fact, there was a negative correlation. So one could characterize the lab theory as sort of those who have social dominance orientation and are right-wing, whereas the 5G theory is people with a similar social dominance orientation but are left-wing. Well, as for the wet market theory, which one could take as the most mainstream theory, the one that tends to be put forward by experts and scientists most often, the article says, quote, "The meat market origin theory is predicted by intolerance of uncertainty and ethnocentrism." So hence, the picture is not very flattering here either, even for people who subscribe to the more mainstream and arguably better supported theory. And ironically, these traits, intolerance of uncertainty and ethnocentrism, these are among the traits that are very often ascribed to conspiracy theorists. Right? So I think this underscores a similar sort of argument to what I was saying before. If you take any set of people who subscribe to any belief and then psychoanalyze them, you're likely to come up with something unflattering. But here I think, it's especially ironic because of how it sounds almost like the classic description of a conspiracy theorist. Now, what if we also apply then the same questions and the same concerns to media and to big institutions? I cited before, hours ago, the case of The Economist and its editorial dismissing the possibility of U.S. involvement in a coup in Chile. One could ask, where are the scholars? Where are the social scientists investigating what is wrong with the editors of The Economist? Why are they irrational? Are they crazy? Are they liars? And in recent years, there have been even more extreme cases where people in the mass media have been presented not only with theories, but with actual direct living proof of conspiracy theories, and have simply brushed them aside as unimportant or uninteresting. For example, in 2018, on the Laura Ingraham show on Fox News, a former CIA director, James Woolsey, went on the show, and he openly admitted to manipulating the elections in other countries. But he said that they did so only, quote, for a very good cause. So this could be seen as an open confirmation of a long-running conspiracy theory that the U.S. rigs and manipulates other countries' elections. But Laura Ingraham simply laughed when he said this and asked no follow-up, demanded no explanation, no specifics, and it led to no further investigation. Then in July this year, just a matter of weeks ago, John Bolton, a former U.S. official, went on Jake Tapper's show on CNN. And in speaking with Jake Tapper, he openly described himself as, quote, someone who has helped to plan coup d'etat. Jake Tapper at first simply ignored this remark, but then later circled back and asked, successful coups? He didn't seem to be concerned that this was illegal or that it was a conspiracy. He asked, were they successful? And Bolton simply cited Venezuela, that he had taken part in an attempt to stage a coup in Venezuela, but then declined to say any more. And Tapper then simply commented, quote, I think there's more you're not telling me, and then let the whole matter slide with no further questions. So one might ask, where are the investigations about these cases? What did these people do exactly? Was it legal? Were they things that the U.S. public would approve of or accept if they actually knew what had been done in their name? Why was there not even just continued questioning from these supposed journalists when these conspiracies are admitted right to them, right in front of them on live TV? So to take Tapper as an instance, doesn't he at least want to ask where? Where were these coups? Were they done on behalf of the U.S. government? Were they done when Bolton was an employee of the United States being paid by taxpayers? Didn't he want to ask whether anyone was harmed or killed in the course of these coups? Fundamentally, isn't it supposed to be journalists' job to investigate misdeeds and uncover truth? So why are they not doing so? Why are they letting these matters slide? Are the reasons for it personal? Are they afraid of conflict? Are they political? Are they psychological? Is there something wrong with their minds, their reasoning, their personalities? Is there some biasing fear of being seen as crazy or outside the mainstream? Is there a conformist impulse or just practical fear of losing one's job? Or, ultimately, is the lack of interest by these supposed journalists a sign of their approval of the conspiracies Do they not want to question them because they tacitly approve of them? Well, this lack of interest, ironically, in investigating this question actually echoes the TV host's own lack of interest in what their guests were telling them, right? And as far as I can see, there has been no pursuit on this other side of the question. Why do some people resist, even seem to not even want to know about conspiracies when they can see the evidence right in front of their faces? Okay, now, as a final point, I've been saying all of these things trying to deconstruct, right, the very idea of conspiracy theories and to question how we talk about them and how we investigate and analyze them. But a final point I want to make is that we need to pursue these questions because conspiracy theories are not going away. They are a necessary and inherent part of American democracy. So as I quoted from Jesse Walker's book, The United States of Paranoia, he rightly pointed out the paranoid style is American politics. Now, on this point, I tend to agree with Jesse Walker, but the deeper question I don't think he really gets to is why? Why is it that these seem to be an unavoidable phenomenon in American life? And the reasons really are pretty simple. They're rooted in the fact that the United States is a democratic Republican experiment. This Republican experiment has always from its beginning been seen as fragile and vulnerable. That is part of its very nature and its self-understanding. And that is rooted in turn in the ancient and Renaissance tradition of republicanism, which has always defined corruption and conspiracies as the main threat to the republic. And we can think again of Machiavelli, who I said was arguably the original conspiracy theorist, as in the first one to systematically study and catalog the threat of conspiracies. And furthermore, Machiavelli argues in his Discourses that in republics, conspiracies do not just come out of nowhere. They are a result and an index of corruption. Corruption meaning the loss of public morals, the loss of commitment to the public good over and above private good. Only, Machiavelli argues, only after corruption takes hold do conspiracies become feasible. Does it become possible for conspirators to bribe and coerce so many people? So it is only feasible, in his words, in a republic, quote, already tainted by corruption. Machiavelli is considered to be the first scholar who systematically discussed how real, not ideal republics, but real republics actually function and how they can actually last and survive in a dangerous and volatile world. And historians, since the 1970s, from the 1970s to recent years, historians have argued that in fact Machiavelli and his disciples, such as the English philosopher Harrington, through the 16 and 1700s, they had a real fundamental influence on how Americans understood republics and understood what they were doing, right? That fundamentally what they were engaged in was the struggle to create and maintain a republic through time. And specifically, the historian J.G.A. Pocock published a sort of seminal book in the 70s called Machiavellian Moment, Florentine Political Thought and the Atlantic Republican Tradition, which in turn sort of laid the groundwork for the school of thought of Bernard Bailyn, Gordon Wood, and others. And this book argues that Renaissance thought actually better explains the American Revolution and the founders than John Locke, right? We have this sort of outsized obsession with Locke, when really, if you look at what they were saying and talking about, it was this Machiavellian tradition and this intense fear of corruption and conspiracies. And one can think, for example, of the Federalist Papers. In the Federalist Papers, what is the big threat that these authors, who call themselves Publius, are afraid of? It's faction, right? And faction simply means any group or party that pursues its own advantages, that uses the political system to pursue its own factional advantage at the expense of the wider public good. And factions are so dangerous because at root they fragment. They present a fragment, a break in the larger single body. the demos or the publius, which is the root of democracy and republic. And this faction then makes decisions, right? The publius or the demos is supposed to make collective decisions through an open, deliberative process. But the faction makes its decisions and pursues its interest behind closed doors, right? In privacy or in secret. And it's very revealing that the authors of the Federalist Papers called themselves publius, right? They see factions as the index of corruption, as the prelude to conspiracy, and eventually to the conspiracy that will destroy the republic itself. So right from its inception, the American Republic has centered on a fear of factions, of corruption, of subversion, and of conspiracy. And in this way, it has always been a Machiavellian republic. And this danger of faction can be seen as entirely internal, right? Statesmen in the 19th century had grown up in the wake of the revolution, and they were taught to fear and to fight against what they called Caesarism, plots to seize power using popular support, right? The fact that a leader has wide support among the masses doesn't mean he's not a plotter trying to destroy the liberties of the republic. And these statesmen often depicted popular leaders as possible Caesars threatening the republic, such as most of all Andrew Jackson, and hence the reason why the opponents of Jackson organized themselves into a party called the Whigs, hearkening back to the parliamentary group in Britain that opposed absolute monarchy. The irony here is that Andrew Jackson actually won the presidency on a massive popular movement, largely by accusing his opponents of conspiring against democracy, right? He said that he had been thwarted in 1824 because of the corrupt bargain between Henry Clay in the House and John Quincy Adams. And this illustrates a very common recurring irony that runs all through American history, which is that different parties and groups who are contending for power all portray their opponents as conspirators, because this is the clearest, most direct way to discredit them as illegitimate actors in a republic. Now, furthermore, the danger of corruption and conspiracy are even greater if they are aligned with an interested foreign power. And this sense that America is serene republic set apart to itself on its own continent, but that is vulnerable to being infiltrated by foreign powers. This fear goes right back to George Washington, the fear of foreign predation, especially by Britain or France. Washington, while he was president, actually denounced the democratic Republican societies that formed around the country in the 1790s in sympathy with the French Revolution, because Washington saw them, for one thing, as an internal faction dividing the organic unity of the Republic, and he saw them as aligned with France, and hence doubly subversive, and he denounced them and basically forced them to disband. And in those early years, of course, the big foreign threats were understood to be Britain and France. Then gradually over time, by 1900, it shifted more to Germany. Germany was seen as the big threat. One can think again of what I mentioned before, of the governor of Florida, Sidney Katz, who alleged that German Catholic monks were plotting against him and trying to incite an insurrection. One can also think of the widespread crackdown through much of the country against the IWW and other radical unions, in part because they were seen as German infiltration. And then, of course, that was eventually eclipsed by Russia, right? So there's a long tradition in the 19th century even of seeing Russia as sort of the ultimate adversary, right? The large, expansive country all the way over at the other end of Europe that eventually the United States would have to face off against one way or another. And especially after the Russian Revolution, more and more Russian infiltration became the big fear. There have been many years of conspiracy theorizing regarding Russia. And so it's no surprise that in recent times, the idea of Russia hacking our election, of somehow secretly manipulating us in the way that we've manipulated other people's elections, has caught on. It often combines together with this growing fear of disinformation and conspiracy theories on the internet, and also current fears that a former president of the United States, whom I will not name, is somehow a puppet controlled by the evil foreign power of Russia. And all of this eventually feeds into the sort of final great Mobius strip, full internal reflection irony, which is that today increasingly conspiracy theories themselves are seen as a result of foreign conspiracies, such as in that New York Times article about disinformation from some nefarious foreign source. So what all of this ultimately adds up to is that all people in the American political system, of all classes and all parties, fear conspiracies. They fear secret, closed cabals, often with foreign backing, and they use accusations of conspiracy against their opponents. This is almost routine now in American discourse. It has always been common, but arguably it's intensifying, right? The fear is not only conspiracies themselves, but conspiracy theories as conspiracies. Now, people can validly dispute and debate about the validity of these different accusations. But what's important that I'm trying to get across is that this vigilance is a fundamental part of American democracy. Think of this common slogan: the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Right? You can't repeat a slogan like that and then be surprised when people start hunting for conspiracies. So as far as that point, I would just say our hope and our demand should not be for an end to conspiracy theories. It's not possible and probably not desirable. Is not desirable either. Rather, our demand should be for more and better conspiracy theories and for better systems of weighing, examining, and testing conspiracy theories. So just for a few concluding points, all sorts of people use conspiracy theories. In all classes. They are not just elite or popular. They come from the state and from private citizens. They can be true or false, well-founded or baseless. They involve biases and motivated reasoning, but so do all kinds of ideas and arguments. Ethical arguments, scientific arguments. Bias plays into all of our reasoning. Americans in particular show their biases and prejudices in their conspiracy theories. One can talk about anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, but nonetheless this does not mean that they can or should be wiped out altogether. If one sees prejudices expressed in science or art or all kinds of fields of endeavor, that doesn't mean we should try to abolish science or abolish art. The fact is that some conspiracy theories absolutely are absurd or malicious, but that does not mean that they should all be dismissed across the board. So the best approach is caution, impartiality, and open-minded skepticism, cognizant of the risks, the biases, and the dangers. So we are in this constant dilemma of having to somehow strike a balance between two prejudices, between being too prone to buy into conspiracy allegations and being too resistant or too blind to the actual possibility of conspiracies. How does one find that right balance? On the one hand, this is just like any other arena of claims or theories. But on the other hand, it is true that conspiracy theories have an unusual attraction and allure. They are always political. They are always symbolically important, expressing fears and grievances. And they do tend to appeal most to certain people based on their personality, their social position, and in this way they are examples of motivated reasoning, and so one should treat them with extreme caution and skepticism. Our approach should not be to try to debunk them, because that assumes falsity, and it should not be to try to create a psychological profile of what sort of person is a conspiracy theorist, but it should be to evaluate and analyze with an open mind and with the awareness of biases. And just as one little illustration of how the struggle with conspiracy theories can lead to greater learning, greater knowledge, how they can be, even if we think they are wrong, they can be productive of learning and expand our understanding of the world, I will tell one last story. It's a story about a woman who lived in the city of Arles, France, and who died in 1997. Her name was Jeanne Calment. And when she died, she was 122 years old. This not only made Jeanne the oldest person in the world at that time, but in fact the oldest person who has ever lived anywhere in the world whose lifespan can be verified with reliable documentation. When she was memorialized and interred, she was referred to in French in her epitaph and in her eulogies as la doyenne de l'humanité, the eldest person of humankind. Now, a great deal of study has been put into Jeanne Calment, into her biography, into her health, her makeup. How did it happen that Jeanne lived to this great age? Because Jeanne Calment was an extreme exception. Not only was she the oldest person ever known to have lived, she actually beat all other records by more than 3 years. So there have been several people in the world who have been known with reliable evidence and documentation to have lived to the age of 118 or 119. There have also been dozens, more than 50 people who have lived to at least 116. But no one else in world history has ever been found to have lived even to 120, let alone 122. So she is a remarkable, stunning outlier in the entire known documented history of humans. Perhaps not surprisingly, this invited some skepticism, right? Not only did doctors and researchers go through the paper trail, find photographs, find witnesses to verify that she had in fact been born in Arles in 1875 and then lived, usually on her own in her own apartment, for decades before eventually going to a retirement home and passing away in 1997. But some people, specifically a group of Russian physicians, were highly skeptical and asked, can we really be sure that this Jeanne Calment is who she claimed to be? That this is actually the same Jeanne? And they pointed out that Jeanne Calment had had a daughter named Yvonne, who was born in 1898, also was, like her mother Jeanne, was known as a vibrant, interesting, charismatic personality who led an active life. But Yvonne Calment suffered from tuberculosis, and she went to sanitaria in Switzerland and died there in 1934 at the age of only 36. Now, some doctors began to say, doesn't it seem more likely that the lady whom we knew as Jeanne Calment, who lived in this retirement home in the 1990s, was not really Jeanne, but rather her daughter, Yvonne? And they theorized that in fact the person who died in 1934 was not the daughter Yvonne, but the mother Jeanne, and that Yvonne had then taken over her name and identity. Why on earth would she do this? Well, this sort of thing happens sometimes. Someone takes on someone else's identity, for one thing, because they can get a much bigger insurance payout. If the family tells the insurers it was this young woman of 36 who died, they get a much bigger insurance compensation than if the mother died. And they found testimonies, photographs of the two ladies, with the mother looking quite youthful, and sometimes people at the time remarked that the two were remarkably similar looking and that it was hard to tell which one was the mother and which was the daughter. So it seems, one could say, it seems as if maybe a switch happened. Maybe this is all the result of an identity fraud, and that the lady who died in 1997 was in fact Yvonne and was closer to 90 years old, not 122. Now, one can make many objections, of course. This is a conspiracy theory. There have been many counter-arguments made against this theory. One of them is simply the implausibility. How could so many people have been duped? How could no one have ever remarked after 1934, it looks like Jeanne suddenly changed? Someone in the family, someone in the neighborhood, no one ever stepped forward and said, clearly Yvonne is doing an identity fraud and has taken her mother's name. So such a fraud by this argument would be incredibly hard to pull off, and it seems quite far-fetched. It is far-fetched. But then one has to stop and ask, as implausible and far-fetched as that conspiracy theory is it any more far-fetched than thinking that Jeanne Calment, uniquely among all human beings in the modern world, lived to 122 years of age? It's true that identity frauds are difficult to pull off, but far more identity frauds have been perpetrated than people who have lived to the age of 122. So if one looks at it just strictly statistically, which of these appears to be more likely? Now, it happens that the story of Jeanne Calment and the controversy over her real identity was discussed in a New Yorker article in 2020, written by a journalist named Lauren Collins. And Collins weighed and examined the different arguments and counter-arguments in this controversy. And she ultimately concluded that the fraud theory was impossible, and that Jeanne must have really been who she claimed to be. And part of how she came to this conclusion is that she looked back into legal and property ownership documents from the 1930s and 40s, around the time when Yvonne died. And she found that there were notaries in Arles who had frequently dealt with the Calment family, and who knew both the mother and the daughter, and who certified various legal documents, and then continued to do so with Jeanne when she made property transactions in later years in the 1940s. And in Collins's view, this more or less disproved the conspiracy theory, because it added another party of people whose careers and credibility are at stake, who confirmed and who never raised any doubt or suspicion that Jeanne Calment was the same woman that she had always been, and that no identity switch had taken place. So in Collins's view, this added another powerful piece of confirming evidence. Jeanne is and always was Jeanne. There was no fraud here. And indeed, this adds to an accumulation of evidence, more and more people around Arles who knew these people, and who, if a fraud took place, would have had to be bought off, or threatened, or fooled, or just been too lazy and indifferent and didn't even care to say anything. And as that circle, that accumulation of people grows and grows, the conspiracy theory becomes more and more unlikely. But it is still a matter of weighing of plausibility. Is it more believable that all those people either were fooled or went along with the fraud? Or is it more likely that this one woman, alone among all known recorded human beings in the entire world, somehow lived beyond the age of 120? And where people place that weight of probability and plausibility depends on many factors. So once again, I am not taking any position on whether Jeanne was Jeanne. I'm not taking any position on whether Yvonne pulled off a brilliant identity fraud with her co-conspirators. I do not know. But this particular case is another instance of where people not only have to argue about what really happened, but have to argue about what is likely and unlikely, what is plausible and implausible. And that, I think, is what we have to do when it comes to conspiracy theories. We do not need to get rid of conspiracy theories. We need better conspiracy theories. We need to take them seriously, but in a discriminating way. We need to demand better researched, better reasoned, more plausible conspiracy theories. And we need to openly discuss our premises of what we believe is really possible, what is plausible, and why. In fact, just by undertaking that investigation and looking for those legal records, Lauren Collins actually showed that the conspiracy theory really was valid, that it was something worth investigating, if only in an effort to try to debunk it, and that it helped her to learn more and establish a better picture of what really happened. And in that way, conspiracy theories can help us, whether we agree with them or reject them. They can help us to better truth and to better awareness of our own thinking and our own reasoning. Thank you.